Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your host, Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast and the official podcast of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. My guest today is Dr. Anne Buckley, who is in the Medieval History Research Center in the Department of History at Trinity College in Dublin. She studies medieval liturgy and medieval music in Britain and Ireland, and is an expert in medieval Irish chant, an undeservedly niche topic that we discuss today in our episode. And we talk also about the impact of Irish Catholicism on the European continent. We hope you enjoy the show. Anne, it's so lovely to have you here with me on the show today. Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure, Jenny. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, it's a really fascinating topic that is perhaps going to be a little bit new to people. So I have some questions that are a little bit more introductory, and one that's rather introductory, but I'm sure that would be you would have an interesting answer to. So could you give us a brief historical recap of the arrival of Christianity in Ireland? Is there much known about the missionaries who preceded or were associated with St. Patrick, and was he the first?
Yes, it's commonly thought that he was the first because, of course, he's the most famous. But in fact, he had a predecessor who arrived in Ireland just slightly earlier in the 5th century by the name of Palladius or Palladius. And he was actually a deacon and sent by Pope Celestine as the first bishop to the Irish believing in Christ, as the quotation goes. We know very little about him, but we do know that St. Patrick wasn't the first. And we also have a few instances of Irish saints who were active slightly before the time of Patrick himself. For example, St. Declan of Ardmore, there are a few of those. So there are little hints here and there about the existence of Christianity, but not a lot to be able to say about it, unfortunately.
So could you speak a little bit more about St. Patrick and the documentary evidence surrounding him?
Yes. Well, one of the interesting things about St. Patrick, along with an awful lot of mythology, of course, and general talk, and of course many of the annals and stories about him exist over the centuries, but in fact he is our first documented author. We have two works which are particularly ascribed to him in his own words, and one of them is the famous Confessio, his confession, or his biography, his autobiography, if you like, and the other was the letter to the soldiers of Coroticus. Now, Coroticus was a British military known as a tyrant, actually, and he and his soldiers came to Ireland and kidnapped and killed many of Patrick's converts. And Patrick wrote the scathing letter to him and the British Christians condemning the deed and calling on Coroticus to return the captives who were still alive. Interestingly, Patrick speaks about peace a lot of the time, and he himself had a very difficult early start, having been captured as a slave and brought to Ireland. So that was how he landed here in the first place. But after some time, he escaped, and we're not sure if he went only to Britain or if he spent some time in Gaul. That's not 100% sure. But he couldn't forget his time in Ireland, and he had this amazing dream that the people of Ireland were calling him back. And that's how his mission actually started. So the seeds were sown under rather different circumstances to the circumstances which eventually became his mission.
So what can we know about the rites used for the earliest celebrations of the sacred liturgy in Ireland? And, what's shrouded in the unknowable past?
Well, from Patrick's own time, it wouldn't be possible to answer that question. Prayers, obviously, of one kind or another, but liturgy as such, we don't have any attestation, historical attestation, until about the 6th century, from which time between the 6th and 9th centuries, we have quite a lot of psalters, gospel books, and some books of hymns. Now, we didn't have a formalized full ritual in the way that we know the Mass and the office nowadays, but we do have plenty of evidence that the Mass was celebrated. And of course, the center of the Mass was always the Eucharist, and the center of the divine office was always the singing of the Psalms and the antiphons. So we can presume a lot on that basis. But what framed it is what is not always so easy to capture. The liturgical books of the early Irish Church were limited to the Psalter, as we know, used in the Divine Office, and then books of the Bible, which provided readings for the office and the Mass. The Psalter was the single most used book in the early Irish Church, and psalm singing was a daily and central practice in the monasteries. The Irish Psalter was based on the Gallican model, which was organised into 3 groups of 50. The 150 psalms were organised into 3, known as the Gallican Psalter. And in Irish, quite commonly, the Psalter was actually referred to as the 350s. And you'll see all Irish Psalters have that feature of the sectional division. And litanies also held high importance in the liturgy. And the litanies are very interesting, not only as litanies per se, but also in the mixture of people whose names feature there, including local saints as well as universal saints. Among the oldest surviving sources are the so-called Cathach or Cahach of St. Columba, also known as Columcille. And that is a psalter from the 6th century, and it's now housed in the Royal Irish Academy. And a shrine was made for it in the 11th century that is now in the National Museum of Ireland. I should perhaps briefly explain that Cahach, spelled Cathach, C-A-T-H-A-C-H, actually means a battler. And that tells another story. Not only was this psalter used in its time for the Divine Office, but it became a very important sacred relic, which was regarded as a protection against soldiers in battle. And it was actually brought into battle on a regular basis to save the lives of those involved. Obviously, always on the side of the heroes, but that was a really important thing. It was like a type of relic. I could go on about the use of prayers and all that as relics, but perhaps that's for another subject, or maybe later in the interview. Other early Irish manuscripts include a really important source known as the Antiphonary of Bangor, a late 7th century manuscript now in the Biblioteca Ambrosiana in Milan, which contains antiphons, collects, and a unique collection of hymns, a number of them honouring the monastery of Bangor and a number of its monks. The antiphons include material for the Divine Office and for the communion of the Mass, and it also contains the earliest known records of the Te Deum and the Gloria. I should also mention that Bangor is one of our most important among many of the early Irish monasteries, which were also schools, mainly for clerics, but eventually also included lay people. It's in the northeast of Ireland in County Down, not to be confused with Bangor, Wales, which is probably better known outside of our circles.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I was a little bit confused about that.
Yes, a lot of people are. Yeah, I know. So Bangor in County Down, yeah. A lot of the major early Irish ecclesiastics were educated there, like Columbanus, for example, and Gall, and Virgil of Salzburg, a number of them. And so this antiphonary, as it's called, but it's more than an antiphonary, is really, really interesting from the point of view of the range of its hymns, a lot of them in Hiberno-Latin, which again is a slightly different subject, but many of them are unique, and they tell us a lot about the monks in that monastery and individual monks who became famous. So we have these very special, unique hymns for them. These would be our earliest hymns for Irish saints, actually. And one can assume that they would have been sung in all of the Columbanian communities, the communities of St. Columbanus on the continent, which would have been in France, Switzerland, Austria, and Italy. Hymns are found also in non-liturgical manuscripts, or what we might call manuscripts that weren't necessarily liturgical service books, and also in separate books of what we would now term sacred poetry, many of which I believe should be classified as hymns. I think a lot of our scholars, say in Celtic studies and Hiberno-Latin, who do such distinguished work on poetry and on language, they don't always consider the possibility of performance and of hymns indeed. So that's, again, something else to think about. But there's a very large number of what we might call hymns in non-liturgical books, which probably were part of a liturgical context at some point.
Interesting.
The Laus Perennis, which is a lovely thing you hear about in the monastery of Peronne, which was a foundation of St. Fursa. It was known for what was called Laus Perennis, which is a concept of an unending singing of the hymns. In other words, all day and all night, there was somebody singing psalms. Sorry, I should have said psalms, not hymns. So again, it just shows how really the Psalter was the center of daily life. Now, how widespread the Laus Perennis was, it's hard to say, but it's also equally hard to imagine that Peronne was the only place where it happened.
So, we see a real flourishing on the continent of manuscripts, especially musical manuscripts starting in the 9th and 10th centuries. Is there some similar sort of flourishing in the Irish sources there?
We don't have any Irish music manuscripts containing notation from as early as that. Our very earliest manuscripts would be 12th century. One assumes that along with a lot of the singing, it was probably largely oral tradition. So there wasn't a formal writing of chant manuscripts until quite late.
So if we look at that earliest layer of liturgical praxis, was it essentially the same as the Roman Rite? I mean, were there unique things in the practice there that we can discern?
Yes, there are. I think it's important to remember that, first of all, we're talking about essentially a Western Roman ritual. Mass and office are essentially Western Roman rituals. But as I'm sure your listeners will be well aware, we have different variations on these in a local sense up to the time of the Carolingian reforms. We have the Gallican, we have the Hispanic, we have the Mozarabic, the Old Roman, and so on. And in this context, there has also been obviously an interest in trying to discover if there was a specifically Irish rite, which we come to again in a minute in terms of current thinking. But without wondering about how we classify it, we do see some evidence of local practice in notes in manuscripts, in little addenda, rather than full liturgical manuscripts themselves. And there are a couple of gems like that. For example, the 9th century Book of Armagh, which contains one of the most important sources for the life of St. Patrick. It includes supplementary notes. It's quite difficult to do all the century jumping. We have a book from the 9th century, but we're talking about a 7th century author because obviously these older books haven't survived, or sometimes things are attributed to some famous predecessor, which may not be, in fact, that person. But that's to go a little bit outside the subject. The Book of Armagh contains supplementary notes attributed to Tíorchán, who was Patrick's 7th century biographer. And Tíorchán is supposed to have added in his biography some information about how the feast of St. Patrick should be celebrated. And he said, on the feast of his death, Patrick should be honoured even in the midst of spring, meaning Lent, for 3 days and 3 nights, with every good food except meat. So in other words, they could relax their Lenten fast for those 3 days. 3 days is quite generous, I think. And they should celebrate as if Patrick in person had come to the door.
This sounds like a almost an American sense of the Feast of St. Patrick in our country.
Don't go there. Interesting thought. So Patrick's Mass should be celebrated on that same day. And also his hymn should be sung throughout that whole time. Not exactly every day, it's all through the day, but throughout those 3 days. Hymnum eius. And always to sing his Irish song, Canticum eius Scoticum semper canere. Now, this is an intriguing reference, not only because it gives us some hint about how the Mass was celebrated on St. Patrick's Day, but also a reference to a song in Irish, a hymn in Irish. So we presume that the first one, Hymnum eius, would be Audite omnes amantes, which you can find in a number of Hiberno-Latin sources. But also, most likely, it's only a hunch, but one of the old Irish hymns for Patrick is Adom Riuch Iuv, and it is known today as the breastplate of St. Patrick, but we have it in an old Irish version as well. And very interesting that we have a reference to singing in the vernacular at Mass.
Yes, that is incredibly interesting. But this idea of being sung throughout the whole time, so it sounds like, that it wasn't only something at the Mass, but at like various points throughout the day?
It's hard to know. It's hard to know, but certainly at every point that hymns were sung, it would have been included. So it probably just means over the 3 days of rituals and ceremonies, but your guess is as good as mine on that one.
Yeah. So this is really interesting as surrounding the practice of St. Patrick.
Yes.
But could you speak about other saints that were particularly venerated and the hymns perhaps attached to them in the Irish office?
Yes, St. Bridget and St. Columcille, also known as Columba, would have been regularly hymned and feasted, if you like. A number of other local saints would also have been hymned, as they say. Oh yes, Ciarán of Clonmacnoise was also very much celebrated. We have 2 copies of the so-called Irish Liber Hymnorum. We call it the Irish Liber Hymnorum because it's specific to Ireland, not just any book of hymns. And there are 2 copies of that, almost identical, but not quite. And they contain quite a range of repertory that one would assume would have been the usual source book for the Mass and the office, particularly the office. That in addition to the apostles, the church fathers and the martyrs, certain saints such as Saint Martin of Tours, who was a very popular saint in Ireland, and there's also early evidence for invocation of local saints.
So, I mean, when one thinks about chant manuscript sources,
yes,
one often thinks, of the continental sources. So what's interesting in your research is the seminal books that should be part of chant study, but for the scholar, but that are Irish sources. Could you talk a little bit more about some of these important manuscripts?
Again, we find details of liturgical celebration mainly in incidental notes rather than in liturgical books themselves. So, for example, we have the Book of Mulling from the monastery of St. Mulling or St. Mullins in County Carlow, which has now still got a very fabulous heritage site there. It's now a gospel book in Trinity College, and it belongs to the second half of the 8th century. And the rubrics for a service were added on the verso of the final folio. So again, it's additional material, probably in the 9th century. And it includes the Magnificat, and it includes several stanzas of Noli Pater, a hymn attributed to St. Columba, a reading from the Gospel of St. Matthew, the last 3 stanzas of Audite Omnes, the hymn to St. Patrick, 2 collects, one of which is a proper collect for Patrick, and the last 3 stanzas of Celebra Iuda, in praise of the apostles, another collect, and the last 3 strophes of Hymnum Dicat, which is a hymn of Hilary of Poitiers, then a collect, the Apostles' Creed, a Pater Noster, and another collect. So it gives us some idea of what the framework of a Mass might have been. Just a quick aside before I go on to another manuscript is to mention that the last 3 stanzas has great significance because there was a rule of thumb, if you like, a grace in the early Irish Church that it was sufficient to sing the last 3 stanzas of a hymn in order to gain its blessing or its benefit. So it is not that they cut up the hymn for lack of space or lack of time. It was actually a particular part of the ritual in order for them to gain the blessing, which I suppose is a sensible thing when you consider that some hymns could have been very long. And maybe on regular days rather than on Sundays, it might have. It's just my thought, but it's a nice little insight that.
Right. Yeah. So that's an interesting source for the Mass. But are there similar sources of particular interest for the office?
Unfortunately, nothing comes to mind that would tell us how the office was constructed in those days. But of course, we do have offices of what we call a regular type, in line with the office more generally, the international office more generally. My own feeling is that it probably wasn't so terribly formalized. I mean, they would have had the hours of the office, all right, but I'm not sure that it would have been particularly different there than anywhere else, beyond obviously its particular days of devotion to local figures. So we have rubrics for a service in both the Book of Mulling and the Basel Psalter, and these are exceptional in that Book of Mulling is 9th century, the Basel Psalter is 8th century. and they happen to contain some outline of a service. So it just gives us an idea of what might have happened.
Right. Can you talk a little bit more about what's in that Basel Psalter?
In the Basel Psalter, yes. Yes, it's written in Irish script, which also contains the Greek Psalter, along with 9th century editions in Latin. And an outline, what appears to be an outline of an office, is included. And again, we're looking very much at Irish influence in the content, because it starts with Cantemus in Omni Die, a well-known hymn to the Virgin by an Irish author called Cuchivna. Then we have a collect for the Virgin, and then we have Alta Audite Ta Erga, which is a hymn for Bridget, and a collect for Bridget. Then Christus in Nostra Insula, which is incipit of the third last strophe, as I was mentioning earlier, of the hymn to St. Bridget. And Sancta Virgo Virgina Maria, a prayer to the Virgin. Then the epistle and a collect, Deus Meus Pater, for St. John. And it has all the appearance of an office for St. Bridget, given the amount of material for her, and indeed a collect for the Virgin, which would fit totally the idea of an office for a Virgin Saint.
Right. I'm really intrigued by this practice of just the last 3 verses. So is it that the other verses would have been committed to memory and they would have just been reciting them and then had only these particular 3 inscribed in the books?
No, well, they would have had the whole book, the whole hymns inscribed in some books, in some hymnals, for example. But in some of them, you'll only find the last 3, because that was what was emphasized for the grace. It was a liturgical point, I suppose, or a theological point.
Right. So, I mean, you're kind of giving us the outlines of these earliest layers of practice, but can you speak a little bit about just these theories that posit an idiosyncratic Celtic rite? And are they something? I mean, are there enough differences to really consider it a very distinct Roman usage in the same way that we would, some of these others like the Gallican, etc.?
I don't think so. And I'm not alone in thinking that. I would consider the local or regional nuances, such as, for example, local hymns and the litanies, for example. But I don't think that the structure was in any way majorly different from the office or the mass elsewhere. I wouldn't. Generally, the consensus is it's not a full rite in that sense that would distinguish it. But simply Irish practice, as we might call it. The other problem is the word Celtic, which is among the most overused words in the universe. It has so many different shades of meaning, and it depends on what you're talking about. But again, a bit like, maybe not quite the same as the term Anglo-Saxon, but it has met with similar controversies in that both of them are referring to languages rather than to cultures. And I mean, I won't go into the Anglo-Saxon thing, because that's a whole other kettle of fish. But we do have this issue of what do we mean by Celtic? And of course, it has so many nuances of meaning. It has political meanings, it has cultural meanings, it has romantic meanings very much. And at the very, very most, I would refer to it as Irish, but not as Celtic, because It's not really helpful.
Interesting.
And of course, Irish exceptionalism, which is another turn of phrase we like to use these days, by people who like to, fly the flag or raise the mast. It really is a 19th century concept, which obviously, probably even earlier, further back than that, which took root in the rise of nationalism. And everything of Irish had to be absolutely different in order to assert, I suppose, a kind of national identity, and to emphasize that we're certainly not British, and we're most certainly not English. And that's not taking sides or anything. I'm simply saying that there was such a need to say we are our own people, we have our own identity, that a lot of this Celtic romanticism really caught on. However, having said that, what intrigues me is that the term Celtic rite isn't at all Irish. It's actually from an English Anglican milieu. We have the most famous book by F.E. Warren called The Celtic Rite. And he and his Anglican confreres from the 19th century were equally interested, at pains, equally driven, I suppose would be another word, in this case to distinguish English Christianity from Roman. And you can see where that's coming from. We had nothing to do with Rome, popes have nothing to do with Anglicans. Well, that's another story, of course, which goes back to, Henry II, or not Henry II, the Reformation. So they were fired up in a parallel way, but for another reason. And they invented the term the Celtic Rite. And the book, The Celtic Rite, which, by the way, is an absolute treasure trove of information, it does have that basic hypothesis, which doesn't really fit the scholarly version of things.
All right. That's a great explanation. I'd like to move a little bit more into your main area of interest, and that's the interaction between Ireland and the continent. So could you speak a little bit about the strong relations between the two in terms of liturgical celebration?
Yes, I'm certainly happy to do that. First of all, leading initially from the connections, these have their roots in what we call the huge Irish missionary movement to the continent from the 7th, 8th centuries, with figures like Columbanus and Fursa and St. Gall, for example, a companion, one of St. Columbanus's disciples, who established monasteries on the continent. They were driven by the notion of martyrdom, and of which there was red, white, and I can't remember the third one, different types of martyrdom in the Irish church. Red martyrdom was blood sacrifice, and we don't have red martyrs apart from one, whom, which is another story probably. But most of them took this white martyrdom, which was exile for life for the sake of Christ. So they call themselves Peregrini pro Christo. Now, some of these saints they brought the cults of Patrick and Bridget and other saints to the continent as well. These are the roots of the cult of St. Patrick and Bridget, particularly in what is nowadays northwest France and Belgium. And we find a lot of references in their manuscripts, and many of which, of course, now are in the places like the Library of St. Gallen in Switzerland, which contain the lives of some of these saints and liturgical references to them. So having had this huge exodus of Peregrini pro Christo, and there's an interesting manuscript legacy they left behind, because they brought their whole scriptoria, they set up scriptoria, and they wrote many manuscripts on the continent in the Irish tradition. Not only liturgical manuscript, but essentially learning. They set up centres of learning in many different places. But the interesting thing where I come in particularly here is my interest in the office and the liturgical celebration of Irish saints in medieval Europe. And these older saints were invoked in a very conscious way in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries in order to give identity, and one might even say authority and respectability, to the new monastic foundations and to the new cathedrals that were being built in many parts of Europe at that time. And one of the ways in which they did that was to commission new offices for old saints. So, for example, we have offices for Columbanus, for Kilian of Würzburg, for Fursa, whom I mentioned earlier, of Peronne, of St. Gall, of Virgil of Salzburg, Dimpne of Geel. Now, these are sometimes a little bit later, but they're part of that general movement. And indeed, some saints who remained in Ireland, such as Patrick and Bridget, for whom we will find some fragmentary material as well in continental manuscripts. So it's very much about reconnecting with the past and making sense of the present in order to promote new identities, if you like. And of course, it's an absolute gift for people like myself, because only for these manuscripts and these new offices, we wouldn't have this very interesting footstep, if you like, this very interesting trace of how this legacy continued, not only over those centuries, but if I could depart slightly from the liturgical topic, in many parts of Europe still there are celebrations of Irish saints, like the popular celebration of Kilian in Würzburg, who is the patron saint of Würzburg. There are processions for Virgil of Salzburg in Salzburg itself. Columbanus still has very important celebrations in Italy and Bobbio. And indeed, St. Bridget herself, there's a wonderful story about her skull, a relic of her skull, having been brought to a place in Lumiar, just on the outskirts of Lisbon now. The parish church of Lumiar is called after St. Bridget, and there's a relic of her skull there, and they celebrate her feast day in an important ritual still today. So I could go on. There's many, many, many examples of that. But my interest is these offices, because my interest is in chant and liturgy. And so many of these new offices, as they were then, tell us a lot about the long-term legacy and that consciousness of the older Irish mission.
Yeah. Let's get into those offices in a moment, but it's really interesting to me that people from the continent would want to source their tradition in the Saints of Ireland. I mean, it seems to be a spiritual shadow that is cast from from the island onto the continent. Why do you think that it loomed so large in people's consciousness of the time span of the church?
Good point. A good question, which I still think about a lot. Well, one is that the memory of the founder saints wouldn't have been forgotten. It would have been part of their heritage, if you like, to know that their founder was so and so and so and so. And not that they were only Irish saints, but they did seem to make a particular impact. But I would say in terms of the offices, it would have been a strategic move, for want of a better term, to give antiquity to the new foundations. And of course, the other thing, and this is a whole other subject about which many scholars have written and are still writing, this notion of, we talk about the ancient East and the far off East, but they talked about the far off West. And, they used to speak about the island in the far Atlantic. It was almost like another world. And you have both the notion of a far and distant place, and you also have the whole notion of something a little bit ethereal or other world. Because, of course, in those days, people didn't travel very much, but they had lots of tales. So there was that element as well of something slightly mysterious and intriguing and
shrouded in some fog over
shrouded in fog.
ocean.
Yeah. That's right. So it was a mixture. It was a mixture of things. Yeah.
So let's talk about how these offices developed. Could you talk about a typical process for the development of for a new office?
Yes, and this would have been true of all sales offices, not just the Irish ones. The office, as I'm sure all your listeners will only be too familiar with, was something that took over at the 24-hour period. It was divided into 8 hours, including matins, vespers, compline, and so on. Lauds. I won't go into that detail because I'm sure your listeners will know very well what an office is. But the office of matins was a particularly important office because it was the longest office and you included a lot of readings. But essentially, the proper office for the saint is based on hagiographic texts. First of all, you have to have a saint's life, a vita, to start to compile your office. And the vita provided the readings of matins. They would have been long readings from the saint's life, but also in many cases, the material for setting the antiphons, the responsories, and the hymns. And sometimes these offices would combine that with some more general material. For example, the office of St. Bridget might include some antiphons or a hymn based on something from Virgins or the Virgin Mary herself, or according to the classification of the saint, an abbot confessor, and a martyr. So, but essentially what made it a proper office was the hagiographic story at the core, and then the setting of antiphons and hymns around that. I should say that very few, if any, because we've still got a lot of research to do, would have been original compositions. And I'm not in search of originality here either, but it's just interesting to see, are there any signs of local nuances? And I would say largely they are settings from existing material. In other words, part of the universal chant repertoire adapted to fit a particular saint.
Is there anything unique about how these manuscripts looked, the script or their musical notation, compared to, for example, the various traditions of notation in other of the main manuscripts that we think about? I'm thinking about, for example, how does the musical notation look differently from Senegal or Laon musical notation?
Well, all of our notated manuscripts are relatively late, apart from some neumes in the Drummond Missal, which are thought to be continental neumes in any case. But otherwise, it's square notation or plain song notation. So we really don't have any kind of Irish musical script. Sometimes there are references to, or there are indications of, the B natural as a clef. But I think that's probably more an insular feature rather than a specifically Irish feature. But sadly, none of our older manuscripts contain any notation. So I possibly never even existed because the writing down of music wasn't really a priority or wasn't really a necessity then. As again, as everybody knows, notation was developed as part of the Carolingian reforms, which reached Ireland sort of indirectly and much later.
And so, when there was the formation of these proper offices, presumably in places that had an earlier monastic connection to these saints, did that office spread more generally such that it became a universal Roman practice from those monastic sources?
Very few did. Very, very few. The Columbanus office would have been sung in St. Gall because Gall and Columbanus were very closely associated, but they would be generally regional. For example, Columbanus is one example, Gall is another example. You would find them mainly in the German, Italian regions. Killian is specific only to Würzburg and surroundings. Fergal of Salzburg also. So apart from, no, at the very most, they would be regional, but certainly not international, no.
Interesting. And would you have, aside from the office text that you're talking about connected to the Vita and the hagiography and stuff, was there a tradition, for example, of sequences for the Mass?
That's a wonderful question because there are very few, but there are some gems. And there is, for example, a sequence for St. Patrick in his Irish office, which is really a stunning piece of work, I have to say. That would be there in an Irish context, I have to say, or Anglo-Irish really, or Anglo-Norman, because we're talking here about the Anglo-Norman time in Ireland, post-12th century. We have some stunning sequences for one for St. Fursa from Peronne, but again, you'd have to see that as a French office, not as an Irish office. Oh yes, a remarkable set of sequences for St. Lawrence O'Toole, which was identified by David Hiley some years ago in a Rouen manuscript. Now, St. Lawrence O'Toole, as I'm sure many people know, was Archbishop of Dublin, and he was on a visit to Rome at the time and died at Eu on his way back. And Eu is in the Diocese of Rouen, and he was venerated there. And in fact, his body and his sarcophagus are in the Collegiale of Eu. I keep mixing them up. Eu is a small town near Rouen, in the Diocese of Rouen. And Lawrence's sarcophagus is there. And he is still venerated in Rouen Diocese, but also in Eu itself. And there is suggestion that the office was more widespread in the Rouen Diocese, but we don't have, unfortunately, a copy of the fully notated office. But we have this absolute gem in a manuscript from Rouen itself, which contains 6 rather stunning sequences, a number of which actually celebrate the connections between Rouen and Dublin. So that's not an Irish manuscript or even an Irish repertoire, but it's again reflecting this kind of thing which I'm so interested in, which is the Irish network, if you like.
Yes. Well, I know that our listeners are going to be very intrigued by your mention of a sequence for St. Patrick. So where might they find some sources or editions of this esteemed sequence?
Well, I have edited one, which I can certainly make available. And also our manuscripts now are thankfully online. All of the manuscripts in Trinity, I should say, are online. And I'd be more than happy to send you a link.
Oh, that'd be wonderful. What's the name of this particular sequence?
Mente Munda, Leta Bunda.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just thinking off the top of my head. If I had prepared myself better, I'd have had it written down here. Mente Bunda, Leta Bunda. Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting. So is it a sort of Vita of St. Patrick in the style that some of these saints sequences are? That it's a kind of like a hagiographical.
Not this particular. I'm just trying to remember now because I haven't looked at it in the last few days. But it's essentially a joyful hymn to St. Patrick.
Well, this is so interesting. So if you could describe for someone, what are some of the most interesting insights that a non-musician might take away from the study of the same manuscripts that you're interested in? What are some of those takeaways?
Well, first of all, because there's very little general public knowledge about this material. People are always surprised to know that we have any music from medieval Ireland. That's the first thing, which I think always amazes even the most, well, shall I say, people who wouldn't normally be interested in those things. They have no idea because it's very, very, very hard to get any kind of listenership for this material. I don't think it needs to be as neat as it is, but there are sort of attitudes and assumptions and so much a welter of other kinds of information about Irish music and Irish music history, which are pretty narrow, if I may say so. They're very rich and very, very interesting, but they're very one-sided. And I think the cultural mix that represents Irish music history, and maybe liturgy in particular, is generally not known, and very few people are working in the area. So the big takeaway, well, let me think. Well, that's the first thing. Did you know we have music from medieval Ireland? Did you know that Irish saints were celebrated in the liturgy? Did you know that these materials contain the most amazing stories based on the hagiography? And a lot of them are very singable. That's the other thing. They're not difficult to sing. I mean, obviously responsories always are, but a lot of the antiphons and the hymns, I would love to see them more generally taken up in schools and centres of education, in parallel with academic research. They really deserve to have a life of their own, I think.
Especially as an American, we often think so much about the impact of the Irish church here in America as one that is largely tending towards things that are very low mass and simplified. And
Totally.
So, just to hear about this body of medieval Irish chant is such a wonderful rounding out of what we should know of the impact of Ireland on Christianity.
Yes, and I could weep at this point because I don't know if this is suitable for broadcast, so I leave a little space. I find the attitude of the church and of the clergy heartbreaking because they've now been inducted into this idea that Latin is verboten, which was never a decree of Vatican II, but it has become normalized. And unfortunately, I think that priests are actually afraid to show an interest in it because their bishops are telling them that it's not allowed. And it's extremely difficult. I have one particular ensemble that work with me quite a bit, and they have really very, very few churches where they can sing in, and almost no churches where they can include this material in the liturgy because of these very narrow-minded strictures that have come in. So that makes it difficult. And I really would like to, make a bit more space for a more tolerant and inclusive approach. Also, and I'm sure you would agree, and I'm sure your listeners would agree, there's nothing quite to equal chant for prayerfulness, for meditation, for the appropriate sounds of the liturgy. And, well, I think it's gone in some lamentable directions in recent years in many places. And we struggle a lot with that. So you can censor as much of that as you want, but that's my honest.
No. Certainly our listeners will be interested. And of course, our listeners do a lot of singing of chant.
Exactly.
And the revival of some of these interesting hagiographical tie-ins are going to be of keen interest, especially here in America.
I'm delighted to hear that. It's my pleasure to share it with you, and thank you for your interest.
So we'll look forward to having some links in our show notes with these particular sources. And thank you so much, Anne, for joining us and helping us understand a little bit more of this undeservedly niche area of research.
Thank you, Jennifer. My pleasure.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is from the Prelude and Fugue in G Major, BWV 550 by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Jennifer Donaldson-Nowicka. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.